the 1980s, survival horror video games were few and far between, especially when compared to how popular the genre is now. There were some early examples like Haunted House for the Atari 2600 and 3D Monster Maze for the Sinclair ZX81, both released in 1982. While these archaic examples are notable, it wasn't until 1989 that the true predecessor of the genre came to fruition. Developed by Capcom and directed by Takuro Fujiwara, the game was titled Sweet Home, even though it was anything but. Part role-playing game and part adventure game, it was released on the Famicom and based on the Japanese horror film of the same name. You play as a documentary crew of 5 exploring a haunted mansion as they search for the lost paintings of a deceased Japanese artist. As limiting as 8-bit graphics can be, Sweet Home was able to evoke horror through its unsettling level design and creepy atmosphere. Even small actions like opening a door created tension as the screen will cut away to a slow and dramatic animation. While navigating the mansion, players had to solve puzzles using strange items to proceed. A finite amount of health items and tonics can be found throughout the mansion, but tough decisions must be made as each crew member has a limited inventory. Your ability to successfully manage inventory can also be affected by the death of a crew member. Unlike most RPGs, where revival is just a spell away, Sweet Home makes death permanent, in turn making combat more difficult. In the end, the survival horror genre learned a lot from Sweet Home, but future games would shy away from the RPG mechanics it employed. In 1992, Infogrames released Alone in the Dark for the PC. It used a mix of fixed camera angles with pre-rendered backgrounds, along with fully polygonal characters to create its world. Set in a 1920s Louisiana mansion, heavy influence of H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe are evident throughout the game. The player must contest with limited resources to fight their way out of the mansion while encountering many supernatural monsters and cryptic puzzles. The game was met with critical success, and it caught the eye of one designer working at Capcom in Japan. After creating a slew of Disney licensed games such as Goof Troop and Aladdin in the 90s, video game designer Shinji Mikami was looking for something to work on a little bit more mature. In an interview from Mikami in 1996, he said, "I wanted to do a really scary game, not ghosts or crap like that, but real monsters that you could see that would come and attack." Takuro Fujiwara originally tasked Mikami to remake his classic Sweet Home for the next generation of hardware. It was originally conceived as a game with a first-person perspective. However, after the release of Alone in the Dark, Shinji Mikami had the template for a game that would revolutionize the survival horror genre. Biohazard ditched the Lovecraftian themes of Alone in the Dark and opted for a more modern approach with its horror. Mikami said in an interview, "I ended up realizing that the game's enemies needed to be monsters of some description, as close as possible to humans in form rather than spirits. Yes, I thought, zombies. At the time I recalled the film Dawn of the Dead. I love that film. It was unfortunate as far as the audience was concerned that they couldn't survive, but with the game, the players could use their own techniques and thinking in order to survive the experience. I thought that this difference between horror games and horror movies could be something wonderful. That was the moment I conceived Biohazard." After a dramatic expansion of the number of people on the development team, Capcom was starting to lose faith in the ambitious project and talked of shutting it down. Lead programmer Yasuhiro Ampo told GameSpot no one at the time expected the title to be such a success. It didn't get any special treatment, and in fact got just the opposite. Most of the time, fresh new faces in the company or staff who had extra time on their hands were asked to help with the game's development. But despite facing such an uphill battle, I think the director's passion and the team's efforts slowly started to come to fruition. And I think that's where we started seeing more and more acceptance of the game within the company. It all paid off in March of 1996 with the release of the game. There was already a DOS game titled Biohazard in the United States, so for legal reasons, it was retitled Resident Evil in that region. The game featured cutting-edge graphics powered by Sony's newly released PlayStation. CD-ROM technology made it so there was plenty room on the disc for high-quality pre-rendered backgrounds, full voice acting, and full motion videos, or FMVs. Reminiscent of many FMV games of its time, the acting in these videos are unintentionally hilarious. Bad acting didn't stop there though. The in-game voice acting was very stilted, and there was plenty of interesting writing decisions.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
The campiness of the game ended up working in its favor though, as it made the game very memorable for years to come. The main plot of Resident Evil has two playable heroes, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, exploring an evil mansion as they search for the compatriots who went missing after investigating the bizarre murder cases that had sprung up in the surrounding area. They are also accompanied by members of their STARS team, Albert Wesker, Barry Burden, and Rebecca Chambers. It does not take long for the game to amp up the scares. Within the first few minutes of gameplay, memorable moments happen that will likely stay with gamers for a very long time. The game successfully sustained tension by preying on the player's vulnerability. Players cannot move while attacking, so they had to be very deliberate with their actions. On top of that, the game has tank controls, making it more difficult to run from danger. Resources are scarce, while enemies are plentiful and varied. Inventory slots became a precious commodity as players must choose which weapons, ammo, and key items to bring along. As the game comes to a close, the player finds himself betrayed by one of their compatriots, Albert Wesker, who works for the elusive Umbrella Corporation, responsible for the virus that created all these monsters. After fighting the Tyrant boss, the game ends with a bang. And a well-earned helicopter ride. After release, Resident Evil met with critical and financial success. Mikami said, "Biohazard sold more than twice the number of copies we were anticipating it might sell. To be honest, I was surprised by how successful it was. It was just a happy accident that the PlayStation market and the saleability of Biohazard matched so perfectly. I think we were very lucky." About a year and a half later, a director's cut of the game was released, with some good and bad changes. Over the years, the game would later be ported to various other platforms such as the Sega Saturn, PC, and the Nintendo DS. At one point, there was even an ambitious Game Boy Color port in development. Capcom acted quickly on the success of the game and greenlighted a sequel. This time, the 25-year-old Hideki Kamiya, who was on the original development team for the first game, was bumped up to direct the sequel. It was decided that the heroes of the first game, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, would be put on the sidelines to feature the introduction of two new characters, Raccoon City police officer Leon S. Kennedy and biker Elza Walker. Finally, it was decided to ditch the trope of the evil mansion in favor of a more relatable real-life location, a city police station. When the team was only 2 months out from the planned release date, the supervising director of the game, Yoshiki Okamoto, Shinji Mikami, and Hideki Kamiya wasn't sold on the product so far. There were concerns that the story wasn't up to snuff and the environments were dull and repetitive due to their focus on realism. The team did not want to release a product that they weren't proud of, so the decision was made to scrap the game that was 70% to 80% completed and start completely fresh. This beta version of the game would be known to fans as Resident Evil 1.5. Elza Walker's character was morphed into Claire Redfield, the sister of the original game's male protagonist, Chris Redfield. The other playable character, Leon S. Kennedy, remained mostly the same. All of the dialogue of the game was rewritten from scratch, minor characters were completely reworked, and the levels were completely redesigned. The story of RE2 has Leon and Claire exploring a police station in shambles after the virus from the original game completely decimated the surrounding area. Leon came to the city to start his first day as a rookie cop at the station, while Claire came to the city looking for her brother. A very ambitious feature called the zapping system was introduced, which forced the game to come on 2 separate discs. The scenarios of the game would change depending on which character you decided to play first. For example, a tyrant named Mr. X will stalk either Claire or Leon, but not both of them depending on which order the player decided to try the characters. Because of that, there ended up being 4 different story paths that the player could experience. They are known as Leon A, Claire B, and Claire A and Leon B. As if that wasn't enough content, there were extra modes that let players control Hunk, an Umbrella agent, and a joke character named Tofu. Adding new weapons, new enemies, and ramping up the action-heavy pacing while still keeping the eerie atmosphere meant there was plenty for fans to appreciate with the game. The protagonists befriend and protect a child named Sherry Birkin in the middle of the game. Sherry is the daughter of antagonist William Birkin, who previously worked for the Umbrella Corporation and is responsible for the deadly viral epidemic that plagued Raccoon City. They also interact with Ada Wong, a corporate spy tasked with the recovery of the sample to the deadly virus. At the end of the game, the crew defeats a mutated William Birkin and saves his child Sherry. Resident Evil 2 was released on January in 1998 on the PlayStation. RE2 sold nearly twice as much as the original game. It was later ported to PC, Nintendo 64, GameCube, and the Gamecom. A Game Boy Advance port was planned, but was ultimately scrapped, much like the original Game Boy port of the original game. George A. Romero, the father of the modern zombie film who directed the Dead series, ended up directing the commercial for RE2. He also wrote a script for the Resident Evil movie, but that version never came to fruition. Years later, Paul W.S. Andersen, the director of the Mortal Kombat movie, created multiple Resident Evil movies that were very, very loosely based off the video game series. So loosely, in fact, the main character of those movies never even appeared in the Resident Evil game series. The success of RE2 cemented the series as one of Capcom's most successful. In true Capcom fashion, multiple sequels were already in development by the time RE2 hit store shelves. The first of which was a side story about Jill Valentine's adventures leading up to and after RE2. A true next-gen sequel to the franchise was also being developed for the Sega Dreamcast in tandem. When Sony started bartering for timed exclusivity for Resident Evil 3, the side story with Jill Valentine became the official numbered sequel, while the upcoming Dreamcast game got labeled as a spin-off. If that wasn't enough, Capcom started developing Dino Crisis, a game which shares similarities to Resident Evil, but with dinosaurs. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis pared down the multiple characters and multiple scenarios of its predecessors. It would be a game that focused on Jill Valentine only, and would be more action-packed than ever before. Unlike the previous games, RE3 primarily takes place on the streets of a decimated Raccoon City. Jill has become more nimble and easier to control. This is helpful because the enemies are smarter and more aggressive than they were in the past. RE3 took the idea of Mr. X from RE2 and ran with it. The monstrous creature named Nemesis shows up much more than Mr. X ever did from the beginning to the very end of the game. He was quicker, more resilient, and could even use weapons like a rocket launcher. His goal is to kill all the members of the STARS team from the original game. The player never really knows when or where he will appear, but when he does, the game becomes much more intense. The creature Nemesis was inspired by Terminator 2 Judgement Day. Producer Shinji Mikami said that he wanted to introduce a new kind of fear into the game, a persistent feeling of paranoia. The Nemesis brings that on in spades. You live in constant dread of the next attack. The idea is to make you feel like you're being stalked. The end of the game features the death of Nemesis.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
And the complete annihilation of Raccoon City via nuke. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis did well, but it did not quite meet the sales figures of the previous game. Development of Resident Evil Code Veronica for the Sega Dreamcast was almost under wraps by the time RE3 hit store shelves. With the power of a next-generation console, the new game ditched the pre-rendered backgrounds in favor of a completely 3D game that aimed for the same quality of detail the previous games were able to achieve. Like RE3, there was only one scenario the player could play. After the events of RE2, Claire Redfield is captured by the Umbrella Corporation and sent to a prison on Rockfort Island, which quickly succumbed to another viral outbreak. The first half of Code Veronica has Claire trying to escape the island. Halfway into the game, it changes perspective from Claire to Chris Redfield as he follows Claire's footsteps to find out what happened to her.
Long time no see, Chris.
Code Veronica reintroduced Albert Wesker, the antagonist from the original game, who we thought was long dead. It also shed more knowledge about the evil Umbrella Corporation schemes. Unfortunately, Code Veronica did not do as well as its predecessors. A big reason for that was due to the choice of console, the Sega Dreamcast. While the Dreamcast had some great games released for it, the system never caught on enough in the mainstream marketplace. After the release of the PlayStation 2, which ended up being the highest selling console of all time, the Sega Dreamcast was sunsetted. Capcom ended up releasing an extended cut called Resident Evil Code Veronica X on the PlayStation 2. Very close to the release of Code Veronica, Capcom was hard at work making a spin-off game for the series. It was to be a free-roaming first-person shooter with light gun controls called Resident Evil Gun Survivor, and it would be released on the original PlayStation. Unfortunately, the tragedy that happened at Columbine High School caused Capcom to make some changes in North America. Capcom stripped out the light gun controls on the North American release and renamed the game Resident Evil Survivor. This did not work in the game's favor though, as it bombed critically. Capcom tried again to make this formula work, this time with Code Veronica assets in arcades. They made the baffling decision to not use light gun support. Instead, they opted to use a gun-shaped controller that was not used for aiming. Later, Gun Survivor 2 would be ported to the PlayStation 2, finally featuring light gun support. But it never made its way to North America. If that wasn't enough, they tried this style again with their sister series Dino Crisis, which also failed. Capcom, who was still determined, for some reason, tried for the fourth time to get this formula right. Resident Evil Dead Aim blended third-person and first-person action together with light gun controls right from the start. It reviewed more positively than past attempts, but it never reached anywhere close to the main series entries, both critically or financially. Nintendo wanted a piece of Resident Evil's success as well. After the RE2 ports on the Nintendo 64, and also another spin-off title called Resident Evil Gaiden on the Game Boy Color, Capcom started developing Resident Evil 0 for the N64. It would serve as a prequel and let players take control over Rebecca Chambers, who was part of the cast in the original game. After about a year in development, the N64 version of the game was scrapped in favor of releasing it on Nintendo's upcoming GameCube console. Nintendo and Capcom surprised everyone with the announcement that the Resident Evil series, at least for a while, would be exclusive to Nintendo's console. This included a newly announced remake of the original Resident Evil. The Resident Evil remake, or Remake as it has been termed, marked the return of pre-rendered backgrounds instead of Code Veronica's full 3D world. Due to advances in their technology, they were able to make the pre-rendered backgrounds almost photorealistic in nature. Add this to the dynamic lighting and shadows, the remake ended up being one of the best looking games for the GameCube ever made. The remake focused on making the series truly terrifying again, and less action-packed. For instance, when a zombie dies and the body is not burned to ash, they will come back as a quick and ferocious creature called the Crimson Head. The material to burn a zombie is scarce, so the players had to be very careful in deciding which enemies to kill, or they would have to face the consequences. The game shuffled around the puzzles and layouts of the mansion, while adding areas and new bosses like the terrifying Lisa Trevor. Upon release, many critics hailed as Remake as one of the scariest games of all time. Resident Evil 0 released shortly after Remake. Instead of the multiple characters and multiple scenario system used in a few of its predecessors, 0 allowed the players to control both characters throughout the entire campaign. This was coined as the partner zapping system, an obvious nod to Resident Evil 2's zapping system. Inventory management was much different this time around. 2 different characters meant 2 different inventories to manage. The game also allowed the players to drop inventory items wherever they pleased throughout the game, instead of requiring designated trunks to unload items. This sounds like a good idea in theory, but in practice, it just became a much more frustrating system. While Resident Evil 0 was not a failure by any means, plenty of fans and critics alike consider it a bit of a disappointment, especially when compared to the Resident Evil remake. Resident Evil returned to the PlayStation 2 with the release of Resident Evil Outbreak and Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. These were new adventures meant to be played online with other survivors via the PlayStation Network adapter. It would still keep the similar gameplay system from the previous entries, but with heavy emphasis on cooperative play. In a lot of ways, the game was ahead of its time. It was separated into smaller, almost episodic chunks, allowing you to play a variety of different characters, each with different abilities. Unfortunately, the games were not as well received as one would hope. The fixed camera angles with clunky controls were starting to wear thin on gamers. The repetitive gameplay featured for the past 7 years also had fans of the series growing weary. Capcom was well aware of the issue. Hideki Kamiya, the director of Resident Evil 2, started his work on Resident Evil 4 years earlier. His game ended up taking a very different and more action-packed turn, so it was decided that it would be turned into its own game called Devil May Cry, which was not connected to Resident Evil. The game went through many different iterations before its completion. These iterations have been dubbed by fans as Resident Evil 3.5, and it took more of a supernatural turn compared to the other entries in the franchise. The first, which is now called the Fog or Mist version, did not have your normal zombie enemy types. Instead, Leon was chased by a dark black fog that was trying to contaminate and possess him. Capcom found this new direction not to be working as well as they wanted it to, so they scrapped it and started over. The next version made its debut at E3 2003, where Shinji Mikami told viewers,
Resident Evil 4 will be scary than ever before. Don't pee your pants.
It featured Leon fighting off moving suits of armor and baby dolls that came to life. Leon was also stalked by an enemy with a large hook as a weapon. Because of that, fans of the series called this the Hooked Man version. It features the traditional camera angles from the previous games, yet it changes to an over-the-shoulder style when aiming your weapon at enemies. Although impressions of the game were positive, the decision was made to again scrap the game and start over fresh. For a brief period of time, the staff worked on a version of the game that once again had zombies as the enemies. Unfortunately, footage from this version of the game is not publicly available. After the failure of these many attempts, Shinji Mikami took up the director's chair once again. In his version, Mikami kept the camera behind the player for the whole game. This camera change made the game even more action-packed without sacrificing many scares. Leon does not fight against supernatural entities, nor zombies. Instead, he contends with the Ganados, who are hordes of possessed people that all talk, run, and use weapons themselves. After starting a job with the United States Secret Service, Leon is tasked to save the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, after she has been kidnapped by the cult called the Los Illuminados. The story is simple and its objective is clear. Leon was given a plethora of different weapons to buy and upgrade from one of the most iconic merchants in video game history.
Got something that might interest you.
Where RE4 especially shines is in its pacing. It's loud when it needs to be loud, and it's quiet when it needs to be quiet. How the momentum of the game swings back and forth between the action and the exploration never keeps you doing the same thing in the same place for too long. The game never feels tedious as it keeps adding new and interesting enemies and environments. At the end of the game, Leon is able to defeat the cult leader with the help of Ada Wong.
Use this!
And he brings back Ashley to the US. Critics and fans loved the game after it released on January of 2005. In the years following its release, it has been on multiple best game of all time lists. While starting as an exclusive to the Nintendo GameCube, RE4 has been ported to a plethora of gaming platforms such as the PlayStation 2, 3, and 4, Wii, Xbox 360 and Xbox One, the PC twice, iOS, Android, and soon the Nintendo Switch. After RE4, Shinji Mikami left the series to start work for Clover Studio and later Platinum Games with Hideki Kamiya. After the great success of refreshing the franchise with RE4, Capcom once again tried their hand at a first-person style Resident Evil game, this time being a straight rail shooter. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles acted as a retelling of Resident Evil 0, the Resident Evil Remake, and Resident Evil 3, while adding some fun side content. The game used the functionality of the Nintendo Wii Remote to make this happen. The game did well enough to warrant a sequel called Resident Evil: The Dark Side Chronicles, which acted as a retelling of Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica, while also adding some more side content. Both of these games were ported to the PlayStation 3, with emphasis on the Move controllers later. Capcom took its time with a true next-gen follow-up to RE4. Resident Evil 5 would star Chris Redfield once again as the protagonist as he investigated another bioorganic weapon threat in Africa with his organization, the BSAA. While the original trailer showed Chris Redfield alone against hordes of new enemies called the Bajini, the final game incorporated a partner for Chris to work with.
My name is Sheva Alama.
The game also marked the return of Jill Valentine and series antagonist Albert Wesker, who certainly received some upgrades. Resident Evil 5 would end up being the first completely cooperative game in the main series. To account for this, the inventory system was now quicker and more strict than it was in RE4. Since the inventory was now in real time, players have to think on their feet instead of harboring in the safety of the old inventory screen. The enemies were also faster and smarter than they were in the previous game, with more using guns of their own. Resident Evil 5 serves as our final goodbye to Albert Wesker, who we thought was dead before. There isn't much chance of him getting up after this one though.
Ready, partner?
Locked and loaded.
Suck on this, Wesker.
Your time's up, you son of a bitch.
Upon RE5's release in March of 2009, the game sold very well. It also did well critically, but nowhere near as well as its predecessor did. Many fans and critics thought it followed the footsteps of Resident Evil 4 a little too closely, harkening back to some complaints the Resident Evil series had before. The third-person, over-the-shoulder camera was becoming more and more prominent with games like Gears of War and Uncharted, so it was hard for RE5 to be as groundbreaking as RE4 was. Some fans remained unimpressed, thinking that the action aspect of the game was too far removed from the series' roots. After RE5 released, Capcom was quick to start working on some portable entries for the franchise. The first of which was Resident Evil: The Mercenaries 3D for the Nintendo 3DS. This game takes the popular Mercenaries time survival game that was previously in RE3, RE4, and RE5 and fleshes it out into its own release. The second portable game is Resident Evil Revelations, also for the Nintendo 3DS, in which Jill Valentine makes a return as the primary protagonist. Chris Redfield and other BSAA agents are playable as well in small segments. The goal of Revelations was to keep the over-the-shoulder camera from the recent entries and to restore some of the survival horror aspects of the older games. The overall pace of the game was much slower as it emphasized puzzle solving more than RE4 or RE5 did. Level design was more open, so it was more likely that players would utilize their map again. The main enemies, called the Ooze, were much more monster-like compared to the Ganados from RE4 and the Magini from RE5. The story was presented episodically, similar to a television drama with frequent recaps of past events. It featured many plot twists and double crosses, similar to some television dramas as well. The game was released in North America in February of 2012 on the Nintendo 3DS. Fans only had to wait about a month after Revelations was released before the next game in the franchise was out. Resident Evil: Operation Raccoon City is a spin-off release developed out of house by Slant 6 Games. Slant 6 was well known for their work on the PlayStation exclusive SOCOM franchise, which is a far cry from the Resident Evil franchise in terms of style. The game is a cooperative cover-based tactical shooter set during the downfall of Raccoon City from RE2 and RE3. Most critics panned the game upon release. IGN's review stated an actual zombie outbreak would have been less tragic. They also called the game little more than a poor man's SOCOM and a destitute man's Resident Evil. Operation Raccoon City simply didn't fit in with the rest of the franchise. It would only take 7 months after Operation Raccoon City until the next game in the main series released, with a very interesting logo. Resident Evil 6 would end up being one of Capcom's largest developed games, with about 600 people involved in its production. They needed all the help they could get considering they created a huge game with multiple campaigns within it. Leon and Helena, Chris and Piers, Jake and Sherry, who was the little girl from Resident Evil 2, all had their own campaigns which would intersect with each other at times. If that wasn't enough, Ada Wong from RE2 and RE4 also had her own campaign. Cooperative gameplay returned for all the different paths as well. Zombies finally made their return to the main series. Players also fight against the Javo, who are similar to the Ganados and the Magini from the previous games. The players could move while shooting. They could also do action movie-like maneuvers while diving to the ground and shooting on the floor. While those new mobility tools were interesting, there was also an abundance of scripted sequences and QuickTime events that some fans grew tired of. RE6 strayed even further from the series' roots as a survival horror game. In 2012, series producer Masachika Kawada told Gamasutra, especially for the North American market, I think the series needs to head in that action-oriented direction. To elaborate further, he said, looking at marketing data for survival horror games, the market is small compared to the number of units Call of Duty and those action games sell. A survival horror Resident Evil doesn't seem like it would be able to sell those kinds of numbers. Upon RE6's release in October of 2012, sales did not live up to Capcom's expectations, and review scores were very mixed. While there are plenty of good ideas in RE6, it just wasn't what most people wanted from a main series Resident Evil game. Around this time, series creator Shinji Mikami founded Tango Gameworks and developed The Evil Within, that was very reminiscent of the later Resident Evil games with a psychotic spin. Weirdly enough, The Evil Within is titled Psycho Break in Japan, similar to how Resident Evil is titled Biohazard in Japan. Instead of jumping straight into RE7, Capcom decided to revisit their 3DS game Resident Evil Revelations and make a sequel. Inspired by the episodic storytelling from the original, Revelations 2 was a true episodic game. Over the course of February and March of 2015, 4 separate episodes were released on digital storefronts that let players control series veterans Claire Redfield and Barry Burton. Gameplay was similar to the original Revelations, with a stronger focus on survival horror when compared to the more action-heavy likes of RE5 and RE6. Unlike the original game, Revelations 2 has a co-op mechanic that is pretty unique to the series. A co-op partner can play as Barry's daughter Moira or the orphan child Natalia. Natalia can see enemies that Barry cannot. Moira doesn't use firearms, but she can use her flashlight to light the way and stun enemies for Claire. The co-op partner can point out items. If the player decided to go solo, he can switch between the partners at will, similar to the partner zapping system of Resident Evil 0. For the first time in the series, both characters can crouch at will, which allowed for some tense stealth sections. Upon its release, Revelations 2 did better than RE6 critically, but it did not exactly light the world on fire, so to speak. In August of 2015, after the successful remaster of the Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 0, Capcom announced the development of a remake of Resident Evil 2 after years of speculation. Things seem to be looking up for the Resident Evil series, although these good feelings did not last long. The next year, Capcom announced Umbrella Corps for the PC and PS4. Their goal was to develop a 3v3 multiplayer shooter with concentrated fast-paced combat similar to what was offered by esports in the market. The maps in the game were based off of popular locations in the Resident Evil series, such as Raccoon City and the Village from RE4. Upon Umbrella Corps' release in June of 2016, it was met with dismal review scores. Simply put, a clunky competitive multiplayer shooter was the last thing that fans of the series wanted to see. Between Operation Raccoon City, RE6, and Umbrella Corps, longtime fans started to believe that Capcom would never return to the more horror roots of the original game. Luckily, Capcom did just that with the reveal of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, which is called Biohazard 7 Resident Evil in Japan. Similar to PT, or the playable teaser to the ill-fated Silent Hills project from Konami, Capcom released a short demo called Resident Evil 7 Beginning Hour. This demo introduced us to RE7's first-person camera as the player explores a dilapidated house in Louisiana while trying to avoid the likes of the unsettling Jack Baker.
Welcome to the family, son.
Over the next few months, Capcom updated the demo repeatedly, adding cryptic solutions to puzzles to help market the full release of the game. In January of 2017, the full game was released on PS4, Xbox One, and PC. If players invested in the PlayStation VR ecosystem, they could play the entire game in VR mode. The protagonist in the game was the newcomer Ethan Winters, although we never get to see what he looks like due to the new camera perspective. Ethan's goal is to recover his longtime missing wife Mia, who is located in the terrifying estate in the swamps of Louisiana. In terms of story, RE7 is very loosely related to the other games in the franchise, with only some small threads connecting it to the other games. In terms of gameplay though, RE7 felt like a return to form for the series, even with the first-person perspective. The puzzles and level design are similar to the old fixed-camera Resident Evil games. Ammo is once again scarce, so it is important to make every shot count. The game truly felt creepy again, taking a heavy inspiration from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise.
Have your supper. Come here, boy. Let's do this.
Ethan confronts multiple members of the Baker family, such as Jack, his wife Margaret, and their son Lucas, after they have been affected by a deadly new virus. Ethan must also fend off new enemies called the Molded that he finds around the estate. RE7 fared much better with fans and critics alike, and many were interested about the future of the franchise. A plethora of DLC was released, including Not a Hero, which let players once again take control of longtime series protagonist Chris Redfield. After 3 years after its announcement, footage from the Resident Evil 2 remake was finally shown at Sony's E3 press conference in 2018. Much like the remake of the original game, RE2 would be reimagined and built from the ground up. The remake would use the over-the-shoulder camera once again, but it would not be as action-focused as RE4 through RE6. With the power of the engine that ran RE7, the Raccoon City police station is creepier than it has ever been, with almost photorealistic graphics. The Resident Evil 2 remake is set to release on January 25th, 2019. Even with the franchise's bumpy history, the Resident Evil series is a cultural touchstone and one of the most important properties to have ever been released in the gaming market. The series has influenced an abundance of other games through its atmosphere, pacing, and general gameplay. It's unapologetic campy fun that will stick in the hearts and minds of gamers everywhere for a very long time to come.
Hey everybody, Logan here. Thanks for watching. This is the third From Pixels to Polygons video I have made, so if you're interested in watching any other retrospectives, you can go ahead and check them out on my channel. Also, if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to send us an email. Our email is channelrequiresdlc@gmail.com. Also, we have a Twitter @channelrecdlc. So give us a follow if you'd like, or if not, I don't really care. You can do whatever the hell you want. I'm not gonna beg you. Thanks guys.